In this video, we're going to make a configuration generator that builds out multiple save-as versions of a part in Fusion 360. Hey everyone, this is Matt with Learn Everything About Design, and in this video we're going to carry on with our API series, and we're going to be making a configurator. Now, that term might be a little bit misleading, but what we're going to be doing is taking data from a CSV file or comma-separated values, and we're going to be using that to change user parameters and ultimately save versions of the same file. So the first thing I think we should do is we should recap what we've learned so far. So this is going to be the next video in our API series. We've already done 7 other videos. So let's just take a second to remember what we've learned to make sure that you don't need to go back and refresh anything. So in our first video, it was a very basic object-oriented programming overview and intro to Python. And again, I'm coming from this from a non-programmer's perspective. I'm not a programmer by trade by any means. So the way in which that I'm going to explain these things hopefully will make sense to someone that does not have programming experience either. So with that in mind, we learned the basics of Python in the first video, and then videos 2 through 5, the entire intent there was to learn how to set user parameters. So we learned how to get them by name. We learned how to get user input and deal with units and values, making sure that the correct value is inputted into the parameter. We learned how to sort of build out what I would essentially call a default or a template file. So running the script automatically built out or hard-coded values into the user parameters. So with that in mind, the next video we did took a little bit of a different approach where we looked at creating sketches. This helped us introduce a couple things like logic and loops inside of the program, but it also let us look at getting access to something else besides document level properties. So we were looking at creating sketches, creating lines and arcs, rectangles and circles, and ultimately we used that to create an aluminum extrusion profile that could then be used for things like extrudes and sweeps. Now in this program, we're going to come back a little bit because we're going to talk again about user parameters. But this time what we're going to do is take a file. In this case, if we look at the change parameters, we've got length and width values. These are 30 inches and 18 inches right now. What we're going to be doing is we're going to be taking a CSV file that has a bunch of different rows of this kind of information, length and width. And we're going to be mapping that to the user parameters and saving out a design that includes these expression values inside of the file name. So the first thing that you should do to get started is create your own design. It can be as simple or as complex as you want, but you need to make sure that the length and width parameters are inside of your design and that they can be updated without breaking the design. Because again, we're not really going to go down and look at error handling and checking. We have done a little bit about that, but I really want to focus on the basics and the nuances of programming these APIs, these scripts, to make sure that we understand just how to access the tools. For me, that's been the hardest part, is figuring out exactly what I need to type in to get these things to work. So once we have that, the next step for me is going to be to create a CSV file. And there's 5 or 6 things that we're going to be doing in this project. We're going to be getting the path of the current design. For me, the project is lead, learn everything about design, and then the subfolder API and the subfolder save test. So we're going to be capturing that data, pulling it out of the document. We're also going to look at another way in which we could hard code the project and the folders. So that's going to be another way. If you don't have your design in the current folder where you want it, then there's another option for you. We're going to be looking at getting the document name. In this case, cabinet is the document name I have here. And we're going to be using that in the final file name with the inclusion of the length and width values. We're going to read in data from the CSV file. We're going to use it to set our user parameters. We're going to create a new file name based off of that information. And again, we're going to save and iterate through the entire process. So the first thing to do is to create a CSV file. Now, it is important to note that there are some things to keep in mind here. Not all CSV files are created equal. When I was planning for this video, I created a CSV file from Microsoft Excel. I saved it out as a CSV, and I had all sorts of issues with it. Now, I don't know if it was the specific CSV format or what the problem was, but in this case, what I suggest is just going into a simple text editor. I'm on a Windows machine, so I'm using the Notepad, and we're just going to enter values as comma separated values directly. So our first cabinet is going to be length times width. So I'm simply going to enter 30, comma 18 as my first value and hit enter. Then I'm going to make several iterations of these. So I'm going to do 30, comma 16, 30, comma 12, and then I'm going to go to 28, comma 18, 28, comma 16, 28, comma 12. You can have as many as you want in here, but keep in mind that each of these is going to eventually it's going to end up producing a new design inside of your data panel. So the more you add here, the longer the process might take. But once we have at least a handful of rows, I would say at least 3, let's go ahead and do a save as. So for me, what I'm going to do is I'm going to save as in a specific location. So this is just a sandbox folder that I have. I'm not going to save it as a text file. What I'm going to do is I'm going to save it as a CSV file. So I'm just going to call it test3.csv. We can call it whatever you want. We're going to have to hard code in the folder and the file. Now, there are some ways that we can prompt the user to go through and select it, but having file dialogues and all the other stuff in this video, in addition to all the new things that we need to learn, I feel like is a bit too much. So we're just going to simply create a simple CSV file. Make sure you save it as a CSV file. And now we have this test3 CSV, and it has all of the different values. So we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Now that we have that and a basic design, remember whatever you want, it could just be a extrusion of a rectangle as long as you have those user parameters for length and width. So those are going to be key. Make sure that you do have length and width in there. Once you have those, then we can get started with our new program. So I'm going to get started going to utilities, add-ins, and I'm going to create a new script. So it's of course going to be Python, and I'm going to put this at the very top again. So I'm going to call this API cabinet door configurator or config. So I'm going to create that. I'm going to hit enter to accept the name, and I'm going to instantly go into editing this. Now for me, it pulls it onto another screen. I'm going to trust the author and get started. So like with everything else that we have, you can see that it starts with the standard program. It says, you know, it gets the application, it gets the UI, and sends a message box that says hello script. We don't need that, so instantly I'm going to go ahead and delete that. There are also some things that we should keep in mind with Python. Now, remember, I am using Visual Studio Code. We talked about this in the very first video. And with that, we have a lot of these helpers. You can see that text changes color, and we have lines telling us where the tabs and indents need to be for certain functions. So you can see the if statement here. As long as everything's indented or tabbed in, it'll be inside of that if statement, again with the try, and again with this section, this def run that we're going to be doing everything inside of. So these are very good helpers. And there's another thing that happens inside of Visual Studio Code once it's all set up. And that's the fact that when you try to call arguments, sometimes it will actually import things for you. So we need one thing, import CSV. So we're going to be using import CSV to actually be able to read our CSV values. This can automatically be populated based on how your Visual Studio Code or whatever programming development environment you're using, whatever you're using, oftentimes it'll automatically import these when you need them. There are things that come in by default like CAM that we aren't using, but a lot of times you'll see that these pop up depending on what you type down here. The only reason I'm mentioning that now is because sometimes if your development environment is not set up the same, then it might not automatically import that and it might not work. So let's make sure at least we type import CSV at the very top. Now inside of here, again, we're getting the app, which is the core application, and it's setting up the user interface. This allows us to do things like call up specific commands like message box, and it also lets us do things like open up the file save dialog if we were going to prompt the user to do that. What we want to do now is we want to think about the other elements that we need. Now remember in the first video, in several videos, we talked about that big object, the PDF that allowed us to sort of figure out where things are. Now that document is very top level, so you're not going to find all of the things that you need in it without searching through the help file. But I do know, because we need to access our user parameters, that we want design, and we're going to set that equal to ADSK, Autodesk Fusion dot design. I'm going to hit tab to accept design. And remember, we're going to be using cast, and I'm going to cast it to my app.activeProduct. Now remember, the active product is going to be the workspace that you're in. We're going to stay in the design workspace, but remember, using these terms, casting is a way for us to, essentially we're assigning it. It's a way in which we can sort of convert what we're working with. So we're casting the current active product into this variable design. Now remember, it's gray because we haven't accessed it yet. I know that we also want to have access to document, because the document, which we're gonna call this document, make sure that you don't hit tab here to accept this, because the document with a capital D is different than what we're typing here. A lot of times in code examples, you'll see just doc, but again, this also comes up, so you need to just be careful that you are making a new variable and you're not accepting something by hitting tab, because you see, as soon as I do that and it creates this capital, you'll notice that it imports some extra stuff for me as well. So let's make sure that we're extremely careful about that. Document equals ADSK.core this time. So this is core functionality, capital document dot cast, and we're going to cast it to the app.active document. Then I want to come back up here and I want to get rid of all this stuff because I don't need it. I just need the import CSV. So now that we have our design, which is going to be the current design that we have open, in our case, it's going to be the one I have called cabinet, and then the document, which is going to allow us to do things like save. Now, always remember that the way in which we code things in here, there are a couple different ways that it can be done. You might see things like doc and then colon and then ADSK.core.document, and that might be, let's say, equal to app.activeDocument. So there are different ways in which we can sort of code this in. I find it's easier to understand the document equals all this and cast it rather than type it the other way. But we covered that in the last video. We talked about the fact that if you see that in a sample program and you see it written that way, where it's got doc or document and colon and then all this other stuff here, it essentially means the same thing. It's just two ways to get to the same data. Now, there are a handful of other things that we're going to need in order for us to actually hard code in the project and the folder, but we'll come back to that when we need it, because we're going to start by showing the easiest way. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to create a space to give me just a little space, and I'm going to start commenting things in. Now, it is important that we add comments, so we're going to use the pound sign, and we're going to start by getting the project folder. So getting the project folder is our next step. I want to make sure that I gather all that data. So the way that we're going to do this in the Fusion 360 API with Python is we need to create a new variable, and I'm just going to call it path. And my path is going to be equal to, this is where it becomes important, it becomes equal to my design. Remember, we set up that variable, design dot parent document. So as you get more comfortable with the user interface, you begin to see that there are certain elements that the nomenclature or the text that we have to type in makes a whole lot of sense. In other cases, it doesn't make sense unless you're, a programmer by trade. But in this case, we have to think about our design, which again is our current active product. We're looking at its parent document. So I'm going to hit tab to accept that. And then in order for us to have a valid path with SaveAs, it needs what's called a data file. So let's go ahead and type this in, and then we're going to hop into the user manual or the help file so we can understand this. So this is going to be our data file, and then we're going to do a period, and we want to find the parent folder. So once we have the parent folder, we're going to display a message box so we can see what this is. So UI.messageBox, and then inside of our brackets, I'm going to do path. But here is something that we need to keep in mind. The user parameters are going to be inside of our document, or inside of our design, I should say. But the document and the data file and the parent folder, all that information that's coming back is not just a string for us to see. So in order for us to actually display this to the user, there's two different things that we have to do. One, we have to do .name or .id. So .name is what the user is going to see. So if you create a folder, you're going to see this actual name, this literal name. If you want to see all the data that's coming out of this, then what we need to do is we need to convert this to a string, because right now it's not just a string. So we can do str, and then we can put this in brackets. And now what we've done is we've called in this function, which allows us to essentially turn this path that we're getting back into a string. So we're going to show this, and I'm going to do another message box, UI.messageBox. And the only reason I'm going to do another one is so that we can completely separate these out. And we're going to do path.name. All right, so let's save this really quick. And before we go any further, let's hop into the help file so we can get a better idea of where some of this came from. Okay, so in the help file, which you can get to from the help menu in Fusion, and if you're trying to program, I'm sure you've got dozens of these tabs open. So the first thing that we want to think about is what we need to access. Our end goal here is to save a document. So the way that I think about this is we've already learned about user parameters, and we've got a decent idea of how those work. We need to think about the CSV import, but the big thing that we need is we need to save a document, save as. So the trick here is figuring out where that is. Now you can type in save as into the search, and that might bring something up. So if we type in save as and we look at product documentation only, you can see here document.saveas method. So when we look at this, this brings up the reference manual under objects. Save as is underneath document. So this instantly tells us that we need access to our document, which we already did with the document, which is Autodesk Core document, and we cast it to the active document. But when we look at save as, and we look through this little piece of code here, making sure that we are on Python and not C++, but when we look through this little bit of code here, this is going to need a name, it's going to need data folder, description, and tag. Now when you save a document, or you do a save as, I should say, you give it a name as a string, you pick the folder, but you do this manually by traversing through where you are in your project, or if it's already in the right location, you just hit save. Description and tag are optional. So when we look through here, we have a return value. So this return value, if we happen to set it equal to something, will return a true if the save was successful. So this is something that we'll look at later once we get to this point. But all the other pieces of information are in these parameters down here. So the parameters are name as a string, data folder as a data folder, and you'll notice that it is clickable, and then the description and tag are all strings. So the strings are pretty easy. Those are straightforward. That's just text. We already know how to deal with the strings, but this data folder is a new type of parameter. So when we select this, it brings us another step further. So the data folder is derived from a base object, and the methods are delete me, upload assembly, upload file, and the properties are data files, data folders, ID, isRoot, name, parent, and so on. So these bits of information, once we've gathered our data file, what we have here is ID and name. And back in our program, if we take a look at what we've typed path.name. We can also type path.id. If I take this back and I hit dot, you can see that we've got name, data files, data folders, ID, isRoot, and so on. But when we look back at things like data files and data folders, if we go back to the help file, you can see that that's what we see here. Data files, data folders, ID, name, and so on. So if we click on name, we can see that it gets and sets the displayed name of the folder. So what we should see is the displayed name of the folder. If we go back a step, if we just call the entire thing, in our case path, we're going to get all this information. We're going to get data files, data folders, ID, isRoot, name, and so on. And when we look at our code, what we're seeing is we have to convert that to a string so that it's readable to us. So let's go ahead and run this. I'm going to save it just since I made a couple changes. Let's hop back into Fusion. We have our object here. Yours doesn't have to be called cabinet. It can be whatever. It doesn't have to be in the same project and folder structure as mine. But what's important is that you note your project and specifically the last folder, the saved test in my case. So add-ins, API, cabinet door config, we're going to run it. So this is the path, in this case, all of the properties that come along with it. Its type is an Autodesk Core data folder. You can see that we've got some other information, and it gives us all these different little bits and pieces that really mean nothing to us. But if we hit OK, the path.name, the actual physical name that the user sees, is just save test. So the reason that this is important is because when we're doing a save as, what it's looking for is just this. And it's not just a string, it's not just a name, it is all that other information that comes with it, because in the back end, Fusion doesn't necessarily care if you've got 10 folders called save test, because each one has a unique ID in the back end. And that's the ID or the information that the program really wants. So when you see things in the help file and it points you to a specific type of data, so if we hop back one more time, back to save as, when it says you need a data folder type for this to work, for the save as to work, that's going to be the key piece of information that you need to hunt down and figure out what a data folder is, how I can work with it, and so on. And again, it takes a little bit of investigative work to sort of backtrack through here. But now we've got a basic understanding of how to get the path directly from the current design. Keep in mind also too, what we did was we grabbed the parent folder. If you think about this, I'm going to call something root path. You don't have to follow along with this, but we're just going to take a look at this real quick. Design.parentDocument.data file, because the data file is what's containing this information. Instead of parent folder, we've got parent project and parent references. There's even one called has parent references and public link. If I select parent project, and down here, instead of string path, I call this my root path. And instead of path.name, I call this my root path.name. Let's go ahead and save this and let's rerun this. So back in Fusion, utilities, API, cabinet door config. Again, this doesn't really look like much to our eye because we're not a computer. All of this data is exactly what the software is looking for. If we say OK, what this is telling me is that the root project is this lead, learn everything about design. That's where I keep all the data sets for the YouTube videos. So when we look at the code for that, we have root path is the parent document, data file, parent project, but the path of the current folder location is just the parent folder of the current open design. So when we're trying to use this data and we're trying to save it, we're trying to save a design to the same folder, we can just use this path. And again, path is a variable name that I came up with. It doesn't have to be path. It's whatever you want. It can be called path123. It doesn't really matter. But the important bit here is that we're using the current design, which is, again, it's the active product for our design. We are looking at the data file property, and we're pulling out a specific bit of that called the parent folder. Then we can use that information to later on populate our save. The harder way to do this, or I should say the more complicated way, if you have to have a specific folder, if you're not in the current location, then you're going to have to do a little bit more work. So let's go ahead and let's tackle one more problem first, and then we're going to circle back to the project folder, hard coding it in. The next thing that I want to do is I want to figure out what the document name is. And again, make sure that we follow the tab or the indent. We need to make sure that we're staying inside of this try, because this is where all of our code is going to happen. So in this case, our path, again, is going to be the parent folder. But what if we want the document name? How do we get that? So again, we have to come up with a name. So I'm just going to call this base name because it's the base of our part. And we're going to set that equal to, now this time instead of the design, we need the entire document. So we need to access document, which is Autodesk Core document and so on. Now, also keep in mind that you can do things like type in all of this information every time you need it down here, but it's much easier just to reference a variable that we set up. So this is going to be our document. And again, it's still a data file type. What we're going to do is we're going to access data file, and we're going to just look for the name of the data file. So we're looking, or we're pulling out that name property. And again, I'm just going to do a simple message box. And what I want to do is I want to display that. I just want to make sure that it's correct. So in brackets, what I'm just going to type in is base name. Remember, base name, that's the property that we came up with. We just called it base name. Let's save this, and let's go ahead and hop back into Fusion. Remember, it's called cabinet. V2 is the version. It's actually not part of the file name. When you look over in the data panel, this is what you would expect to see. So if we run this, API cabinet door config, you can see it brings back cabinet. If we were to rename this, or your design is called whatever, that's what you would expect to see. So now we have that second bit of information. We're going to be pulling in all of this data from our CSV to configure the doors, and we have every little piece of the basics to figure out where to save the design, what the file name is going to be, or the root of the file name. And now we have to think about the other bits and pieces. So we need to think about how to get the CSV data in. I'm going to go ahead and delete that message box, and what we're going to do with that data. But I did mention that there is another way to get the path. So let's go ahead and let's talk about that. We're not going to be using this code. So if you don't want to manually code in the path, then you can go ahead and skip ahead to the next chapter. But I think it's important that we talk about it because you won't always be able to just pull the current path and use that. You might want to save your base designs in another folder and then save your new designs to another place. Again, there are ways to pop up a file dialog to where you can have the user select a folder location, but that is a bit outside of what I want to cover here because it just opens up so many other things that we need to get into. So again, this is kind of a pain, but let's go through the process of how we would access and set the folder location manually. So first, we need access to a bit more. When we got the path, we accessed it through the design. So we cast the current document into, or we cast the current active product into the design, and then we were able to use that to traverse down to parent document, to the data file, to the parent folder. If we're going to manually find it, then we actually need to have access to app data and the current active hub. Because the way that this works is when you run this code, the script is going to look through every project you have. It's going to check the string, the name, against what you're looking for. So the first thing that we need is we need access to the app data. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a new variable called data, and we're going to set this equal to app.data. So now we can use data to begin to access a bit more downstream, or through that hierarchy. The next thing we need is we need the active hub. Now keep in mind that in Fusion 360 you can have multiple hubs, so it's only going to be looking in the current active hub. I think there are ways that you can look through all hubs and activate one, but honestly that's just going to be a mess. So we're only looking in the active hub, which is equal to data, which is the variable we just created, dot active hub. Notice also that we have active project, so you can choose how far back you want to go to start looking, but active hub is going to go to the very top level of your data panel, to the current hub that you have or that you're working in. Now for a little bit, probably about a year ago, you could not work between multiple hubs at the same time. If you tried to switch hubs, your designs would get closed. I think at this point in time, we're in April 2022. I think at this point in time, you actually can have a design open between different hubs, but again, I don't even want to think about that at the code level. So now that we have the data and the active hub, the next bit about this is to start getting into setting up our variables to access these. So I'm gonna go ahead and use some standard nomenclature. If you look through help files, if you look through forum posts, this is likely what you're going to find. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna use proj as the project, and I'm gonna use the nomenclature that has the colons, and this is gonna be equal to adsk.core.our.data.project. So inside of here, you can see there's a lot of different data. There's data project and data projects, but we want the singular of that because we're only looking at pulling out one project. Then what we need to do is we need to get the project files. So again, we're going to have to make another variable. This is going to be files project. And again, I'm going to use the same nomenclature. It's going to be our adsk.core. Again, most of the save and the document level stuff is going to be in core, where some of the other stuff like the design level stuff, things like user parameters, getting the current active design information, the parent folder, it's going to be at the design level. So we're at the core level, and what we're going to do is we're going to have, again, we're going to do data projects. So I'm just going to start typing that in. And then what we need to do is we need to tell it that there is none. All right, so the way that this is going to work is we're essentially level setting. We're saying that we're not looking at the current active project. What we're saying is there currently is no project, because when we're traversing through the file structure, we want it to start from the base. All right, so now that we have this bit set, we're gonna have to go through the next steps to figure out if we actually have a project that we're looking for. And the way that we have to do this is by creating a for loop. Now, the way that we're gonna do this is we're gonna use this for loop to go through all of the projects, and it's gonna look for a specific project name. So for proj, now remember proj is the Autodesk Core Data Project. So for project in our active hub dot data projects, so in the active hub dot data projects, the way that we do the for loops is, again, we end with a colon, and when we hit enter, it's going to automatically tab us in. Now it's going to go through every project in the active hub and the data projects. Now what we're going to have to do is set up an if statement, and the if statement is going to look for a very specific one. So if proj, now we also have to remember that there's a ton of data that goes along with these bits, right? So when we looked at path, when we wanted to display it to the user, we wanted path.name, or we needed to change it to a string. So proj is the same. What we need to do is we need to look at the name of the project. So if the name of the project, and in code, we need two equal signs. If it's equal to the text string, again, we're going to put in our quotes, and in my case, that is lead. The project that I'm looking for is the top level of where I want this data to save. And for if statements, for loops, all these different things, we need to end that with our colon. We hit enter, it's going to automatically tab it in for us. So as we're going through all of the projects in our hub, if we come across one that's named lead, which is what we're looking for, then we're going to set our proj files project. Remember, this is the variable we came up with that's set to our data projects, and it's currently set to none. We're going to set that equal to proj. And this does more than just set it equal to the name. What this is actually doing is it's bringing in all the data associated with that project. Remember, when we displayed it as just a literal, we turned it into a string, but we displayed it. It's all that different code that goes along with the project. And then if that works, if we find the one that we want, then we're going to break out of the if loop. So we're going to stop there. We're going to hit enter. Notice it tabs us back to the if. And from here, what we have to think about is anything that we do at this level is still inside the for loop. So we want to hit the backspace to go back to the start of the for loop. So remember, anything tabbed in is going to be happening inside of the for loop. Anything tabbed in from the if is going to be happening in the if loop. Okay, so this is not it. There's still more to do, because at this point, all we found is the project itself. Now, remember, in my case, I had two subfolders inside of the project. I was inside of an API folder, and then I was inside of a save test folder. So the way that we need to go from here is is we need to drill down to those folders. Now, we already know that we have the project, and the project contains all the folders. So all of the different bits and pieces are inside of there. So what we're going to do is we're going to set up our project folder. Again, this is a brand new variable, and this is going to be equal to our project files project. These names are starting to get crazy, but it's going to be equal to this. So proj files project dot root folder. So the root folder is the top level of that project, and data folders. So remember, we're accessing all the same bits, the data folders and data files. At this stage, the data file is the information about the path of our design that we're working on. Because we're still traversing through folder structures, what we're doing now is we're looking at data folders and not data files. So the data folders is going to be searching for an item by name. So we've used this item by name before when we were looking for our user parameters, and it's going to be called over and over again because it doesn't just apply to one thing. And then inside of our brackets, we want the literal string that we're looking for. So this is going to be API. So we're looking for the item by name, which the item by name is automatically looking for the proj_folder.name, just like we did up here, right? Proj.name. So once we have that, we've got that second level down, that second folder down. So now what we need is we need the folder that in my case is called save test. So I'm going to call this new variable save test folder because I know that's exactly what it's called. This is going to be equal to our proj folder because remember, everything has a hierarchy. And now that we have access to our lead project, the next folder down is API. And from the API folder, then we have access to the next level down. So this is where I'm going to find my save test folder. And again, it's going to be proj folder. In this case, it's going to be data folders again, but we don't have to go to the root folder because we're no longer at the top level of our project. The root folders are those first levels underneath your project, and then the subfolders are just going to be they're just going to be considered data folders. So from here, once we have our data folders, again, we're going to find our item by name, and we know the name, so it's save test, and this is very specific. You need to make sure the capitalization, the space, all that is correct. Okay, so we did all of that work just to get to the same information that we got from this one line of code. The difference here is that this gives us the ability to go to a different project, to go to a different subfolder, and sort of pick a place that we want to save. I strongly suggest that you just worry about saving it to the same folder, and it's so much easier, it's so much less code. But all of this information here got us to the exact same bit. So if I do a UI message box and I display save test folder dot name, then what I'm going to get is the information that's essentially just this line of text. But I'm going to do a plus, and I'm going to add a space in there. I'm going to do a plus again and do save test folder dot ID. So here's, again, we're accessing the same information. So just to double check that, let's do a UI.message box, and let's do path.name plus a space plus path.id. So theoretically, these two text box or message boxes should give us the exact same thing. So let's save that. Let's go back to Fusion and let's just double check. So when we run the code API cabinet door config, as it goes through, you can see it's taking a lot longer. Nothing's happening for quite a while until we're prompted with this. Now, the reason nothing's happening for quite a while is because I have a lot of folders in this project with a lot of data. So it has to go through all of them until it finds this one. And while in the data panel, they're displayed alphabetically, in the back end, they are going to be in order, I believe, in the way that they were created. So if this project happens to be the 100th project that I created, it has to go through all of them. So pay close attention to this, save test, and then this is the ID. If I hit it OK, it's giving us the exact same information. So once again, when we think about the code, we have to think about, can we just use the current folder location where the document is, or do we really need to drill down to get all of this? So again, we're not going to be using that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say edit toggle block comment, and it's going to put quotes before and after that. All of that is now in quotations. We don't need it, but if you somehow want to use it, then you can. And we actually don't even need this bit. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to put the 3 double quotes here, and then I'm going to get rid of those 3, which should put all of that inside of that comment block. We do also need to make sure that the tabs and the indentions are correct, which those will change because I added a bit more. Anyways, now that we have all that information there, hopefully you can see that this is a whole lot easier than this, but this is sort of a necessary evil if you have to go through, traverse all your projects to find a specific folder that's not the current document folder. Okay, so let's go ahead and save this. You'll notice that it's showing red. It's saying that there is a problem, and you'll notice that it's saying that there's a problem in try. It's telling me that there's at least one except or finally clause. Well, essentially what's happening is this block of code is causing problems because we haven't finished, and it doesn't like having this in here. So just for the time being, I'm going to delete all of this. Again, we don't need it. So if you followed along and you happen to need it, then make sure you leave it in your code. If you don't need it, it certainly cleans things up quite a bit. Okay, so let's think about the next step of this process. The next step for us is we have to read a CSV file, and we have to use that data to set the user parameters. Now, a couple things have to happen to make this work, and honestly, when trying to figure out this program for this video, this gave me the most trouble. And what I mean by that is when reading and setting the CSV parameters, in addition to saving, I had some trouble with it being in a specific position in the loop. So we're going to go through that. I'm going to talk about that process a little bit, and ultimately I ended up going to the Fusion API forum to get help, and was able to get the answer there, at least how to make it work, not why it didn't work before. So let's go through this process of just accessing the CSV data. We're gonna, again, do this in a slow, methodical way. We're gonna push the information just to a UI message box to make sure it's coming in. And once we know that it's coming in, then we're gonna learn how to handle it. So the first bit of this is we're gonna set our file. And our file is gonna be equal to open. And inside of here, you need to figure out where your file is located. So I just copied the location of it from my computer. You have to figure out where yours is. You want the complete path, including the .csv. And that is going to allow us to open the file. Now, that doesn't mean that the file is going to be open on the screen. It just means in the back end, it's able to find and access that data. Now, here's where things got a little tricky, because ultimately, we can loop through the file and display the code, but the best way to do it, and ultimately the way that worked, was to dump all of the data in the file into a list. So we're going to talk about the 2 ways. We're going to do it sort of the wrong way first, and then we're going to go back and we're going to fix it. Now, when I say do it the wrong way, I don't necessarily mean that the process is wrong. The code will still work, but ultimately, what we're going to do is something different. And what I mean by that is right now what we're going to do is traverse through the file in a for loop. But ultimately what we end up doing is we're going to put all the CSV data into a list, and then we're going to access the list. So first, let's make sure that we can get the CSV data. So we're going to say for, and remember when we're doing for loops or if statements, we don't have to pre-declare a variable. If you're coming from another coding language, oftentimes you have to say like, define a variable before you can use it. In Python, we just need to say for, and I'm going to use a very literal name, for a line in file, and again with the colons. So essentially what we're doing is we're saying for every line in the file up here, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be pulling out the different pieces. And I've seen this a couple different ways, so we're going to try something here to see if it works. We're going to say pieces, is equal to the line. Remember, the line is this variable dot split, and we're going to split it with the comma. Remember, these are comma separated values. So that line of code is essentially saying that the pieces are going to be the bits inside of the CSV file that are split by the comma. Then we're going to define length, which is going to be eventually is going to replace our user parameter, as equal to the pieces. We're going to use the brackets and piece 0. Then we're going to say width is equal to pieces, and again, the box brackets 1. So theoretically, this line of code will go through every line in our CSV file, and it'll set up length as the first bit, separated by the comma, and width as the second bit. But we're not going to know that anything happens. So what we're going to do inside of the for loop, remember we're tabbed in, we're going to do a UI message box, and we're going to display, in quotes, we're going to add a string, length, dash, and then we're going to do plus, and just type in length. So what we're doing is we're pulling in whatever is passed through there. Then we're going to do a plus, width, dash, plus, width. So what should happen, let's go ahead and save this. What should happen is we open our CSV file. For every line in the file, we are going to split, and we're going to pull out the first piece, or piece 0, as a string, and we're going to pass that into our message box. We're going to pull out the second piece, which is piece 1, as the width, and we're going to pass it in here. So let's run the code and let's see what happens. So remember, if we go back to our modify and change parameters, we've got length and width in here, and right now they're 30 inches and 18 inches. So if we go to utilities and we run this cabinet door configurator, the first time it comes through is 30 by 18. Let's take a quick look at our CSV file. 30 by 18 was the first one. If I run this again, it should be 30 by 16, then 30 by 12, then 28:18, 28:16, 28:12. So we know that it's pulling the data in. So that first part is great. However, remember that I said that this wasn't the right way to do it. Now, when I mean it's not the right way to do it is that when I go through and I update the model with these inside of the for loop, the save was only working on the last save. And in order to get it to work, all of the CSV data had to be pulled out and put into a list before I ever got into the for loop. So the reason I wanted to do it this way is because I wanted to break down each line bit by bit so we understand what's happening. And now that we know that we can get the data in from the file, let's go back to the drawing board and let's learn how to do this in a list. So I'm going to come up below the file and again tab in, make sure that we're in the right location, and then we're going to start to program it to put it into a list. So the bit of code that we're going to use is we're going to use with. So with the file is, again, it's the open CSV as F, and again, we're going to do our colons. And essentially what we're saying here is we're setting the file equal to this variable, and you'll notice it says text IO wrapper. So there are some unique uses of F, and we can talk about F a little bit more at some other point. But just note that essentially what we're doing is we're creating a reader, and we're setting all of the data from the file into a list. So we're just going to call this this new variable reader. Again, what we're doing is we're naming this, and we're setting it equal to list. List is a command in Python. So what we're doing is we're accessing this list command, and we're going to use brackets and CSV. Remember, CSV came into play from this import CSV. Now, if you hadn't typed this before, this is a good time to see how your development environment is set up and if it automatically populates. If this doesn't turn green, then it's not populated correctly. You need to make sure that import CSV is up there. But what we're going to do is CSV.reader, and inside of brackets, what we're going to do is just put F. So remember, F is that variable we created. What's happening here is now all the data in that CSV file is getting put into this list. And once it's in this list, then we can begin accessing that data every time it goes through. So it automatically is going to apply essentially an ID for each of these, which means it's very easy for us to pull out. So again, backspace to make sure that we're in line with everything else. We don't want to still be inside of that with block. I'm going to put in a space just to clean things up a little bit. And now what we're going to do is we're going to do our for loop. So inside this for loop, now we're going to look for our CSV data. Again, this is a variable name we are creating. It could be called anything, but using variables that make sense just looking at the code, because Python is a very literal language, it really helps to sort of figure out what's going on. So for CSV data in our reader, so that's this variable here that now contains our list of CSV data. And again, we want to put those colons after. What we're going to do here is we're going to say length is going to be equal to our CSV data, because remember, we're pushing it into this, and we're going to use our 0 position for length, and we're going to do the same thing for width, equals CSV data, and this time it's going to be the first position. So now let's just check this inside of this for loop. So UI message box, again, we don't really need to do the message box thing, but it helps us running it in Fusion. Typically when you debug, you would just print to the console inside of the whatever development environment you're using. I found that it's much easier for me when I'm learning to run it through Fusion and then use these message boxes to send me data back. It just kind of helps me. It's not necessarily required. If you're comfortable using a console and using print, then obviously you can do that as well. So what we're going to do is the same thing. Length is going to be equal to plus length. And we're going to go ahead and add a couple spaces. I'm going to put width. And again, plus. Remember, again, with Python, it's very literal. So we can do plus to add text strings together. Because the information that's contained in length and width, those strings are going to be the same type as the strings that we have here in yellow for length and width, which means that we can just use add to put them together inside of our message box. If it was a different type, if I tried to add an integer to a string, it wouldn't work. But in this case, they're all strings, so it's fine. Again, let's save this. Let's go back to Fusion and let's run through and see what happens. So again, API cabinet door config, length and width. So there's a couple extra spaces really help to push these, let them wrap around. So length and width, 30 and 18, 30, 16, 30, 12, 28, 26, and so on. So now we're making progress because we did the exact same thing, theoretically, by putting all of the CSV data into a list and then accessing the list down here in our for loop. So this means we're on the right track to get this to work. We're in a good place. So I'm going to go ahead and delete my message box. I don't need it. But now what we need to do is we need to start setting the user parameters. So we're going to create a new variable. And again, we can call it whatever we want, but I'm going to stick with my CSV lingo. So CSV params, so our CSV parameters. And that's going to be equal to, remember, our user parameters are in our design. So our Autodesk Fusion design, which we cast to our active product. So design.user parameters. Now we can set our user parameters. And this step here is something that we never did in our user parameter videos. We got information from the user parameters by name. We created our own user parameters. And then we eventually built to the point where we got some user input and so on. But what we're going to do now is we're going to say our CSV params are going to be dot item by name. So again, this item by name comes up. Length. So this is going to be the literal string. It has to be exactly matching whatever is inside of your user parameter. So in our case, it's called length in the user parameter. We're going to do dot expression. So the expression in the user parameter is the actual value that we're using to set it. And we're going to just say that that is equal to length. That's the variable that we created to hold the length data. You can see up here, length is now white, width is still gray. So we're going to repeat the process again. CSV params dot item by name. This time, it's going to be width. Again, capitalization, everything has to match. Expression is equal to width. So what should happen now is when we run through this program, it's going to modify the design each time it goes through. Notice that we still haven't used the path or the base name because these will come into play when we set up our new file name and when we save it. But right now we want to check to make sure this works. In order to pause the program each time through, I'm just going to do a UI message box. And we can use UI message boxes to just have like an OK button, but they're actually different types. So you can see message box button types here. You can do a yes, no option, and you can give the option to sort of break out of the loop if it's not working. I'm not going to go into that in this video. We're just going to do, we're just going to say work and question mark. Again, we're not going to give the user an option for yes, no, but that is available through the UI message box. Okay, so now let's check. Let's double check, modify, change parameters. We're at 30 and 18. That's where this design starts at. So in the add-ins, my API cabinet door config, we're going to run, work. That first value is actually 30 by 18. So now when we click OK, it should go to 30 by 16. You can see it's a little bit narrower, a little bit narrower. Now it should go back to 18 wide, but I think it's 28 or 26 inches tall. So it gets shorter and so on. So we know that it's working. At this stage, what I'm going to do is close this and not save it and just reopen it because we don't actually want to save that. It doesn't really matter if we save it, but there's no need to. Okay, so we're getting much closer. The code works. We know that it works because it does update the design. So at this point, let's go ahead and just add a couple comments before we get too far. So open the CSV file and push data into a list. Then our for loop down here, this is going to go through each line in the list and do something. Now, ultimately, the something we have is updating our parameters. We're going to create our file name and we're going to save it. So down here for the parameters, what we're going to do is we're just going to say set user params from CSV data. And the next bit in our code, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be setting up our new file name. So set up a new file name. When we're doing our new file name, there are different things that we can do. We can use just the standard file. So in this case, we could just manually type in the string cabinet or whatever you want. But we already went through the process of getting the base name of the document, so we might as well use that. So what we're going to do is we're going to get the base name of the document and we're going to incorporate it into setting up a new file name. Remember, the new file name is going to be a string because that's what the SaveAs wants. So just like everything else, we need to make a new variable. So I'm going to just call this new file name. And this is going to be equal to the variable we created up here, base name. So this is pulling out the document's name. So we're going to start with base name. And we need to add some extra information to it. So again, because they're all strings, we can do plus. I'm going to do my quotes. I'm going to put a space, dash, space, and then plus. Then we're going to add length, plus. Now, when you type in the single quotes, here I'm going to hit space, X, space. When I type single quote again, it'll just hop to the other side of it for us. It can be a little bit quicker when you're typing. Then we're going to do plus width. So now, theoretically, the parameter should change the design. The new file name should update based on the base name of the document, in my case, cabinet, It's going to add a dash, length times width. So now the next bit we can do is we can set up another UI message box and display that file name for us, or we can just go ahead and try to save it since this is essentially the last step in the project. So what we're going to do is for access to save as, it's going to be inside of our document. So the document is our Autodesk Core document, which is the current active. So we're going to say document.saveas, and this is going to be our new file name, which is a string, the data folder, which is of data folder type, and then the description and the tag. Those can be empty strings. They don't have to be populated, just like when you save a new design. So we're going to start with our new file name, comma. Remember that our path is just path. And then this could be the description, and this could be the tag. So if you want to include those, you can pull that data from somewhere. It could be in the CSV file. It could be wherever you want. But let's go ahead and save this, and let's run it and see what happens. So if we did everything right, theoretically, what should happen is we get, in my case, 6 new files over here in the data panel. I don't have any UI message boxes. Nothing's going to pop up for the user. It's just going to run through and do it. So API cabinet door config run. Runs through each of those. All of them pop up in the data panel. So you'll notice that it's working through because it is uploading all the data files to the cloud at the same time. And then you can see now we've got 30 by 18, 30 by 16, 30 by 12, 28, 18, 28, 16, 28, 12. Now, the one thing that I found, or the one potential problem with this, is you'll notice the last design here is cabinet 2018 by 12, or 28 by 12. And that's the one that says is currently open by me. But it also says that this one, the original design, is still open by me. I'm not sure if that's something that I did in the code or if it's potentially a bug, but the way around that is to just open this design back up, and that sort of checks it out and checks it back in. So again, that's really the only hang up with this that I found. Everything does seem to work okay. And you can have as many or as few lines as you want in your CSV. You can see that we did 30, 18, 16, 12, and we've got 18, 16, 12, and then 28, 18, 16, and 12. So all of those built out properly. We can add as many or as few as we want, but keep in mind that you should be using values that work for your model update. So let's look at the code and let's think about next steps for this. So a couple things that you could do to continue from here. Instead of pulling in the document, the base name of the document and using that, you could include a line in your CSV file and pull that out as your file name. So for example, in our CSV, we could have something like cabinet 1, comma, and we could do the same thing going through. Now, the reason that you might want to do this is because if you don't want to just use a literal name like cabinet 30 by 18, you might want other information. Say you have a part number or you have another description that you want in there. You could also pull out information such as the description. Maybe you've got a customer name or something like that you want to use. So if you have multiple lines inside of here, so let's go ahead and just delete that, and I'm going to go ahead and save. So now I've got cabinet 1, 30, 18, and customer. The way in which we would deal with this is now instead of having 0 and 1 for length and width, length is at 1 and width is at 2. But now we also have this other information. So what we could do is we could change this to 1 and 2, and we could pull in other data. So customer equals CSV data, and inside of our brackets, that's going to be 3, and maybe new name could be equal to our CSV data, and that's going to be position 0. So if we want to run through this, we could say UI.messageBox, and we could just display our customer, and we'll just do plus, and I'll add some spaces in here, and plus our new name. So as we run through it this time, what we should see is that we've now pulled in those extra bits of information. Everything else should still work fine because the rest of the data is okay. One thing I'm going to do is I'm going to change this to a different number. So that way when it does run through and save it, it's a completely different file name. But let's go ahead and hop into Fusion and let's run it and just see what happens. Full disclosure, I haven't tested this before, so this is kind of an on-the-fly adjustment. But as we run it, customer cabinet 1, and it populates. So you can see 36 and 20 is here. If we expand this, you can see the description is here, DESC. So all that information seems to come in fine. So if you want to use this process to pull in more information than just length and width, you can pull in tons of data as long as your CSV file is formatted in a way that makes sense for you. So there are other ways that you can work with the data and drop off, let's say, the first line if it's just a description. And in this case, again, we took a very simple approach. I am going to get rid of the customer and new name, and I'm going to set these back to 1 and 0. And I'm going to reformat my CSV because that was the original intent here, was just to have length and width values. But again, you can do anything that you need or want in your own designs. So we're going to go ahead and do 3212, and we'll save that. So let's go ahead and just test it one last time, and we'll talk about next steps. It is important to remember that it is looking for the base name to set our file name. So if I ran it off of this design, it would work, but it would also include 36 by 20 in the base name and then add the other information. So that is something to keep in mind, that if you're going to use the same technique, your base name should be something that makes sense. Let's go ahead and run through. You can see in this case, it says that there's a problem, and that's because I left the UI message box in there. So because we no longer have a customer and new name, that information is not valid. So let's go ahead and just get rid of that, get it out of the code. We'll save it, go back to Fusion, and we'll run it one more time. So again, it makes 2 new versions. You can tell here that it's got some information. It says length CSV data is out of range. And when something like that happens, when you get an error message, essentially what it's telling you is that there is probably an extra space in the file. So you can see here the cursor is on the next line. If there is an extra space like that, then it's going to produce a problem. So the format of the CSV is extremely critical. So now that I fixed that, let's get rid of 32 by 12. I'm going to delete those last couple. We're going to get rid of this one, and we'll get rid of 36 by 20. And again, Fusion in the back end, it has unique IDs for each of these, so it doesn't care if you have the same file name, which can be a potential problem, obviously, but just something to sort of consider and keep in mind. So now if we run through, we shouldn't have any error messages because the CSV doesn't have that extra 0 in it, and it does create and populate those. So again, next steps for something like this. This does not look for any user input. Everything is directly from the CSV or hard-coded in. Sort of a next step could be options to pop up a dialog and give the user some additional options, maybe to change the file name, or give them the ability to create the base name, and then it could just simply populate the new file name with that user input rather than pulling it from the document. So those are some simple changes where you can just get a UI input. And so we could use an input box and allow the user to sort of pass back something. So this could be base name 2 equals UI message box. And remember, the input box is going to have a prompt, a string, and it's going to send data back. So when you pull that information out, you're going to be looking at the tuple, which is the string, and the Boolean, which is true, false. So you're going to want to make sure that you access base name 0 if you do something like this. So what we're going to do is we're going to say enter a file name. And again, this is sort of an on-the-fly thing. The next thing is the title. So new file name. and a default value. So what we could do for the default value is we could say base name. So we're pulling that base name directly from the data. And then if we want to use base name 2, we could do some conditional things. We could come down here, and for the new file name, this is going to be base name 2, but we want to pull out that first element. So let's see if this works, and we'll give it a shot. So back in Fusion, again, we want to make sure that we have the original cabinet open. We'll go to Utilities, and we'll run this API door config. Now it's asking the user for a new file name. Enter a file, it's automatically populating it with cabinet, but now I want to have something that says new cabinet. I say okay, all my files now say new cabinet 36 by 20, 48 by 20, and so on. So again, that is a very basic change that we could make to the program to give the user some input on things like the file name. There's obviously more that you could do, but without a specific project in mind, the sort of configurations and changes could be almost endless. But this is this can be a very powerful tool because Fusion 360, at least at this current time, doesn't have configurations. This can be a great way to use external data like a CSV file, read that data in, and build out a ton of different versions of things like mounting plates or hardware or designs like doors and cabinets and things like that. So at this point, I think that's as far as I'm going to take it, at least in this video. It's been over an hour. So if anybody has any questions, please let me know. As always, thanks for watching. Let me know what you'd like to see out of an API series, if there's something specific. This entire idea came from just emails from subscribers. So if you have something specific you want to see, I'm happy to try and figure it out. Remember that I'm learning along the way as well as you guys. So just keep that in mind. If there's something you want to see, send me an email, support@caducator.com, or leave it in the video comments. And as always, thanks for watching. We'll see you in the next one.